Today's World Insight. Amid extreme weather like heat waves, simmering geopolitical tensions sparking fuel and food crises, financial trouble weighing down economic growth, the world appears to teeter on the brink of the worst. What will it take to pull back from the edge? We'll hear from Dean Mauro Guillen of Cambridge Judge Business School in tonight's presentation of Growing Pains to Building Resilience, Asian Financial Crisis 25 Years On.
I don't think we have the kinds of governance mechanisms right now that we need in order to handle all of these issues in the world together.
In 1997, East Asian economies severely hit by the Asian financial crisis. Through heartbreaking experiences and extremely hard work, these economies survived, learned lessons, and increased resilience individually and as a whole. Today, they thrive as a global engine for growth. But amid the world's current complex realities, how could Asia reflect on the growing pains, prevent itself from being dragged into another crisis, and be a resilient beacon in a sea of change? Join us on this special series, Asian Financial Crisis 25 Years On, as we learn from key witnesses, pragmatic thinkers, and crucial stakeholders. Only on CGTN.
Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. We are continuing to presenting to you the special production, Growing Pains to Building Resilience, Asian Financial Crisis 25 Years On, through exclusive interviews and crucial global discussions. As we know, every crisis has its own unique characteristics and circumstances. Today we are facing with a world of complex geopolitics, sluggish economic prospect, and lingering pandemics. It takes wisdom, cooperation, and guts to change it for the better. That is, according to Mauro Guillen, the Dean of the Cambridge Judge Business School. He's also author of the latest book, 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything. There is my conversation with him. You've been having a lot of sociological studies about today's world and its future trends. Tell me more what the impact of the pandemic might be for the current world and likely leading up to the future.
Well, I think the pandemic has had many implications. Of course, the most tragic one is the loss of life and the disruption of everybody's livelihoods and lives, especially of children. But more broadly, if we think about the next 5 years, the next 10 years, I think the biggest impact of the pandemic has been the acceleration in the use of technology. We're using now a digital platform to communicate, and we are using these kinds of platforms more frequently as a result of the pandemic, to work, to study, to interact with one another, to entertain ourselves, and so on and so forth. But there's also many other ways in which the pandemic has changed things and has accelerated pre-existing trends in the world, and I would be very happy to comment on those.
Professor, in your latest book, How the Current Trends is Likely to Change and Reshape the Future, you talked a lot about how the society is actually having an impact on future, and also how it is going to shape the future. So tell me more with the example of the pandemic.
Well, let's begin with population. Well, we all care about population, of course, because the size of the market depends on that, because also the political system and the economic system depends on the number of people and how old or how young they are. Think about pensions, think about taxes, think about entrepreneurship, everything. And what has been going on because of the pandemic is that, unfortunately, many young couples all over the world decided to postpone having children. And so the decline in the number of children has accelerated. It's a problem, as you know, that is afflicting Japan, is afflicting East Asia, including China, also Europe, very soon as well the United States and other parts of the world. And so the pandemic accelerated that trend, meaning that it essentially made it even less likely that young couples would have children at least momentarily because of the lockdowns, because of the economic difficulties, because of the uncertainty. People don't like uncertainty. They don't like to make big decisions, such as having a baby, when there's very high uncertainty.
So, Professor, what does that mean for policymakers?
Well, what it means is that policymakers have to, I think, bring forward into the more actions, more policies to try to make the most out of that process of demographic decline, but at the same time also protect us from some of the consequences. I think the best illustration of that is pension systems, right? So increasingly what we're having is only 2 people working for every person who is in retirement. This is already the case in Japan. This is already the case in China. This is already the case in Europe. Yeah. And that is problematic because obviously there are costs, not just the pension, but also the healthcare and other services that people above a certain age require. So I think the response by policymakers has to be to anticipate the problem, to realize that if before the pandemic they needed to take this much action, now after the pandemic they need to take more action and earlier.
But this is hitting us at a very weak point, isn't it? When the global economy has only been beginning to recover and yet is already having the potential of heading into recession and probably even crisis.
Absolutely. You see, I think the origins of this have to do with 2 very important causes. One is that the pandemic essentially meant that many countries looked to protect their own populations. And they started not to care about the rest of the world. So they tried to secure masks, they tried to secure equipment for hospitals, they tried to secure vaccines for their own populations. So what we saw as a very important first impact of the pandemic was, I think, a more inward-looking attitudes. Countries became more focused on themselves as opposed to trying to help others. And that, of course, created a situation in which there was less trust in the global economy. Now, the second problem, as you know, has been the labor shortage and all of the bottlenecks in supply chains, in part driven by some of the nationalistic responses to the crisis, but also because of the fallout from the pandemic. People were essentially reporting sick, so they couldn't go to work. And also, of course, there was the problem of work itself being restructured so that the largest possible number of people could work from the home. And as you know, in most countries, about 50% of the population, people like you and I, were able to work from the home, but other people couldn't, right? Because they have to show up at the factory or they have to show up at the place of work. So those 2 sources of disruption essentially have created a lot of problems in the global economy. And one of the biggest, most clear manifestations of that, as you know, especially in Europe and the United States, has been inflation, which, if you remember, was not a problem for the last 30 years. But now we're seeing again inflation, and inflation is something that, if it gets out of control, can be very dangerous to the economy and to the society and to social stability.
Many wonder whether our societies have really progressed much in terms of how we work with one another. You earlier talked about lack of trust. That has been also reflected on many issues in geopolitics and politics of various countries. How do you see whether we learned or not through earlier times? Let's just say now already people are cautioning against the Cold War. Remember, we had a Cold War decades ago.
Yes, and unfortunately, this is something that goes in cycles, right? So we see at some point in time a lot of collaboration, a lot of cooperation among countries, and then something gets in the way. Maybe there's a war, maybe there's a big disagreement, maybe there's a big economic crisis, and suddenly there's no cooperation. I think we're now in that second part of the cycle, unfortunately. Already before the pandemic, we started to have trade frictions in the world. So countries worrying about whether they had big deficits and then accusing other countries of being the reason why they had a big deficit. And so we have a big problem right now. And I think we need to continue pushing political leaders and economic leaders to talk to one another, to meet, to discuss their problems, We don't necessarily have to ask them to come up with a solution or to come up with cooperation, although that would be nice as well. But at least to be talking to one another, to be meeting. Unfortunately, also, as you know, during the pandemic, many face-to-face meetings were canceled. And that includes summits, right? So the most important global leaders, did not travel to other countries at all. We have very big global problems that require a coordinated response. And at the top of the list, of course, I think is climate change.
We in China have seen with big surprise how some parts of the world have been portraying China with such a wrong image that inside China, one could hardly match what is being described with what is really going on the ground here in this country. Professor, you have studied sociology and trying to link sociology with the studies of the global governance, of institutions, politics, and economy. How do you understand there's a huge divide, it seems, not only about the issue of China, but also about people's mutual understanding of one another? Is this, once again, going in cycles? Do human beings have the capabilities to learn?
Well, I think, yes, it also goes through cycles. As you know, for the longest time, more than 25 years, the United States and China got along with each other really, really well. Not only that, it is very clear that both China helped the United States with its problems, like, for example, servicing its debt and buying treasury bonds. And also the United States helped China develop through investment, through access to its own domestic market. It seems as if that agreement that China and the United States were, let's put it this way, two sides of the same coin, a coin that was essentially meant to be prosperity, right? Unfortunately, over the last 6 or 7 years, that kind of a mutual understanding has broken down. And I think that's a disaster for the world for two reasons. One is that these are the two largest economies in the world. And secondly, that these two economies are intertwined, are interconnected financially in terms of the movement of goods, information, technology, and so on and so forth. Now, there are some people who argue that what should happen is the so-called decoupling, separating China and the United States, not having as many relationships. Perhaps some of that interdependence needs to be reduced, but I think going all the way to the extreme to zero interdependence between the US and China, that's what could create the conditions for a Cold War. Because remember, the Soviet Union and the United States didn't have that many relationships. They were essentially operating in two different worlds. Not a lot of economic interaction between the two. That created the conditions for a Cold War. I don't think we are there right now, but we could be if we continue down this path of decoupling, of separating China from the United States.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines. Lately, we have seen both the climate change bill and also the chip bill put forward by Washington. Many of those specific contents is being read very specifically in a way targeting what is going on in China or between China and the United States. That is creating quite some concern. Professor, let me also ask you about the so-called decoupling issue. We used to believe, I don't know whether you still believe this or not, what you just talked about, that the trade makes the world go around. The trade and economic ties is one of the major pillars for economies and countries to work together and for the necessity of them to cooperate. But as you said, the fact is clear, it is interdependent. And yet, it seems that logic has been fading away in the air, at least at this moment. What's going on?
Well, as you know, the political climate in the United States is one in which people on both parts of both sides of the political spectrum would like to see a United States that is economically more independent. And that relates in particular to technology and to manufacturing certain kinds of things, like including chips or semiconductors, electronics, and also equipment that is needed for the climate transition, like solar panels and so on and so forth. So there is that emerging consensus in the United States. But what I think is really important is to balance that political will that exists right now in the United States to do more strategic manufacturing within the US and to keep the technology, American technology, from being used in other parts of the world. That has to be balanced with something also about what we were talking a moment ago, which is keeping a relationship between the US and China, between the US and Europe for that matter, between the US and India. Why is that so important? That's so important because if we don't do that, then things will evolve towards the United States creating its own sphere of influence and China creating its own sphere of influence. And so we would, I think, then be moving in the direction of a polarized world, a bipolar world, US and China, with Europe somewhere in between, and Japan, and so on and so forth. That is, I think, what we need to avoid. We need to find an equilibrium where the United States feels comfortable manufacturing more of the strategic things that it needs to manufacture. We need to find a scenario in which China also feels comfortable in the sense that it can continue to grow economically, it can continue to make progress as a country that eventually will be a rich country and technologically already quite advanced. But at the same time, without essentially completely splitting, so that then, as we were talking earlier, we create the conditions for a Cold War. A Cold War happens when you have two spheres that are, fighting against each other.
Professor, you have seen how things evolved over the past 2 years between China and the United States, and also about the international governance system. You see a lot of voices were calling out, saying, please, we need to be cooperating at the very beginning. But then you see those voices becoming ever dimmer as situations got worse. How do you read the latest situation, Professor? And from a sociological perspective, how do you see the importance of these voices and the environment to nurture these voices?
Well, I primarily see it as a governance problem. So in other words, I don't think we have the kinds of governance mechanisms right now that we need in order to handle all of these issues in the world together. So in other words, that we don't see the big countries in the world going their own way, trying to fix these problems. Many of the global governance institutions that we're using, if you remember, were created right after World War II. And that was a very different world from the one that we have today, unfortunately. It is only natural that emerging economies, such as China or India, feel that those institutions don't really represent them anymore. So I think we need to engage in institutional or governance innovation in the world. But once again, that cannot happen unless the leaders of these leading nations meet and they talk to one another. There are, of course, contacts at a lower level, right, in the administration of the China and the United States and Europe and so on and so forth. And that's good. But we also need more contact and more interaction at the highest level.
Professor, in your latest book, how do you see the biggest trends are shaping our future? Who are shaping our future? Can we rely on them to shape our future?
Well, one way of answering that question, in my book, 2030, perhaps the biggest trend that we have to pay attention to is women. What is going on with women, okay? Why do I say that? Well, I say that because, as you know, over the last 20 or 30 years, women have been increasing their educational credentials. And when they increase their educational credentials, that means they want to have a career and they find jobs and they get promoted. There is still discrimination, but they're making a lot of progress. That also means they postpone having babies or they don't have them at all. So that triggers a number of demographic changes as well. But, I should tell you that at least, theoretically, in terms of perceptions, there's two very important things that we win when there are more women in politics, when there are more women in the government, when there are more women in business. And you may be surprised about this, but the perceptions of corruption, for example, around the world, are lower the greater the number of women in positions of power. So in other words, women seem to be better leaders because they're less corrupt than men, right? On average, right? And these are perceptions, of course. But then there is, another very important, I think, issue that is really, really critical. We know from research, we know from experiments that women have more of a long-term orientation than men when it comes to making personal decisions, when it comes to thinking about the decisions that the world needs to make. Women are more likely to focus on a longer time horizon than men. That's exactly what we need right now in the world, I think. And we need to start thinking more about the bigger picture.
Professor, I want to come back to the issue of trust, which you touched on earlier. May I ask another follow-up question on that? There is a lack of trust, as you pointed out, and we see it at the highest political level and geopolitical level, global governance level. How do you see that is tripling down to various levels of society as a result, and eventually could bring out all the ills of the societies which have been put down through the past few decades? Are you worried about that?
That's a great question. So we have established already that there is mistrust or lack of trust between countries in the world. And I think you're absolutely correct in suggesting that that lack of trust has been permeating, has been trickling down the social structure in societies. So I'm not an expert on China, but I can tell you that in the United States, in Europe, in other countries around the world, what we're seeing is also a breakdown of traditional trust structures in the society. And I think a very important consequence of this has been political polarization within countries. So the situation that we find in many European countries, in the United States, that the extremes, the political extremes, have now more people supporting them. And they don't trust each other at all. It's as if they lived in completely different countries. And they actually describe reality, the situation, in a completely different way, right? So that lack of trust, I think, has been promoted by some politicians, has been promoted by, unfortunately, also social media, because as you know, there's a lot of fake news. There's a lot of, distortions of reality circulating out there. And that creates a lack of trust in anybody whom you do not perceive as being on your side. And this is very, very problematic, especially in Europe and the United States.
How do you see the practices of two extremes? One is nurturing hope, the other is manipulating the public. Sometimes it is a very interesting question, particularly at critical times.
Well, that's why leaders of countries, leaders of organizations, leaders in business, in every realm of society, they need to strike a balance between the two. So in other words, you have to be able to convey a sense of there's a future, and the future can be better than the one that we have today. But at the same time, you have to balance that with an accurate assessment of the reality right now. Maybe there are certain unpopular policies that need to be put in place. Maybe there are certain, privileges that need to be taken away. Maybe strong action needs to be taken. We see this today, for example, especially in Europe, with the energy crisis. And we see governments trying to encourage the population and companies to save energy. But we also see a lot of backlash and people not really taking that seriously. I think the fundamental background problem is what we've been discussing, lack of trust. That is to say, the population in many of these countries no longer trusts the politicians as much as in the past. And therefore, when the politicians tell them we have to save on energy, people don't believe them, or they don't believe them, or they believe that they are exaggerating how much energy needs to be saved in order to make it through the winter.
Professor, my final question. You are in a very important position one could argue, your job is creating the business elites of the world. If that logic still works, business makes the world go around. What do you see as the most important and crucial tasks that you have when you try to cultivate the next generation of business leaders?
Well, you're absolutely right in that I think universities in general and business schools in particular have a very important responsibility, which is to educate people who have the right values and give them the tools or the instruments, the knowledge that they will need in order to make positive changes in the world, to have positive social impact. And, I always say that there's never been a better moment than today to attend business school and to study management or business. And that's because there are so many problems in the world, and we need good managers to address them. We have climate change, we have inequality, we have trade frictions, we have technological change. So in other words, yes, our role should be to educate those people, providing them with the requisite technical knowledge, but also infusing in them good values, right, about having a positive social impact in the world. It's a big responsibility, I think, that educational institutions everywhere in the world, in China, Europe, and the United States, have. And quite frankly, I think this is a very important moment for us. If we fail at succeeding on this, I think it will have bad consequences for the future.
Mauro Guillen, I'm so glad, Professor, that I had the chance to talk to you at a critical time. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you for having me.
My conversation earlier with Mauro Guillen, the Dean of the Cambridge Judge Business School. That's all we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team, thanks for being with us. Bye for now.